Welcome to Life Unfolded. Today, we discover the life of another remarkable woman. The blood of my brother was still staining the wooden floor when my father turned those empty eyes toward me and said that now I was the only thing left of his family. It was in that moment I understood my real nightmare was just beginning. Before I begin, I want to know where you're watching my life story from. Feel free to leave a comment and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And give this video a like. My name is Eudoxia McKinley, but everyone here in Brook Hill Springs, this forgotten place in the drylands, knows me as Miss Dolly, the old lady who sells coconut sweets at the Sunday market. I'm 84 years old, my hair is as white as cotton, and my hands are calloused from a lifetime of hard work. Those who see me now, always smiling and handing out treats to kids, could never imagine the pain and strength that live inside my chest. I was born in 1941 in a simple clay house on a small farm about 5 miles from town. Our land wasn't much, around 30 acres, mostly dry brush, but we had a good patch for planting cassava, beans, and corn when the rains came in time. We also had a few cows, some chickens scratching around the yard, and an old donkey named Dusty who pulled our cart when we went into town. My father, George McKinley, was a hard man, not one for many words but full of demands. Early on, he taught my brother Jeremiah how to work the land and handle the small businesses he kept running. It started with a little shop at the edge of the property, then a flour mill that served the neighbors, and finally a construction supply warehouse in town. Jeremiah was his pride, his mirror, his continuation in this world. A man who doesn't leave behind a son to carry on is like a tree with no roots, he'd say after a few drinks at dinner, rambling on about life. As for me, I helped my mother with house chores, learning to cook, sew, make soap and sweets. A woman's worth, Mama used to say, is in how well she keeps a house and pleases her husband, always bowing her head and agreeing with everything my father said. Jeremiah was 10 years older than me, a handsome guy with a quick smile and almond-shaped eyes he got from our grandmother, who people said had native blood. Unlike our father, he was kind to me, brought me candy from town, taught me how to whistle, told ghost stories that made me sleep with the blanket pulled up to my neck during winter nights. When I inherit all this, he'd say, "I'll take care of you, Dolly. I'll build you a pretty house with a big porch and a kitchen full of pots." But fate is a cruel beast that doesn't care about plans or promises. In 1958, I was 17, and Jeremiah was 27 when measles swept through our region like a storm, taking down people left and right. And first the school children, then the adults who'd never had it as kids. Jeremiah was one of them. At first, it was just a fever and red spots on his face. "It's nothing," he said, stubborn like our father, refusing to stay in bed. He kept working at the warehouse, catching rain, sleeping poorly. In 3 days, the fever climbed so high he began to hallucinate, calling out for people who weren't there, screaming that his back was on fire. My father finally agreed to take him to town, but the road was a mud pit from all the rain. The Jeep got stuck twice. When we finally reached the health clinic, the doctor just shook his head. "This one's got pneumonia on top of the measles. I'll do what I can, but it doesn't look good." 3 days later, Jeremiah left this world in a stuffy room reeking of medicine and pain. He didn't even have the strength to say goodbye. Just squeezed my hand, looked into my eyes and whispered, "Take care of Mom, Dolly," before going, taking all my father's dreams with him. The burial was quick, as it always is in the countryside. Couldn't wait long in that heat. The simple pine wood casket lowered into the red soil of the town cemetery while the priest muttered hurried prayers. My father didn't shed a single tear, just stood there like a cement statue, hat in hand, eyes locked on the hole swallowing his only son. Mama sobbed quietly, leaning on me, her legs giving way with each shovel of dirt. We returned home in a heavy silence that choked even our thoughts. I didn't know it yet, but that silence was just the calm before the storm. For a week, Dad barely left his room, barely ate, didn't speak to anyone. I heard him pacing at night, the floorboards creaking under his heavy steps, sometimes the clink of a bottle letting me know he was drinking from the one he kept hidden in the closet. On the 7th night after the burial, I woke to a loud crash. I ran to the living room in my nightgown and found my father standing in the middle of the house. The dining table flipped over, dishes shattered on the floor, and blood I'll never forget, running from a deep cut on his hand where a piece of broken glass had lodged itself. There's no point anymore, he yelled, eyes wild like a wounded animal. Why build? Why work? Why save if I've got no one to leave it to? Mama tried to calm him, speaking softly, approaching like someone trying not to scare a vicious dog. You've still got the girl, George. We have Dolly. That's when he turned those hollow eyes toward me and said the sentence that would change my life forever. That one? What's a woman going to do with everything I built? Hand it to the first man who shows up? No, Sebastiana. She's all I've got now, and she's going to have to serve. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't quite understand what he meant, but something deep inside me, maybe the same instinct that makes a bird fly off before the snake strikes, told me I was in danger. That same night, while I cleaned up the mess he had made, I whispered to those of you watching now, if you can, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It gives me strength to know someone's listening after so many years of keeping this story inside. Give this video a like so maybe it reaches someone who needs to know that surviving even the worst nightmares is possible. In the days that followed, my father began to change. He stared at me strangely during meals, started insisting I learn about the businesses, that I go with him to the warehouse in town, understand how to manage stock and money. If you're going to inherit this, you need to know how to run it, he said, but there was no care in those words. Only restrained anger, like each explanation was an accusation. You're not Jeremiah. You'll never be. At night after dinner, he began to drink more than usual. What had once been a shot or two turned into entire bottles. And with the drink came violence. First against objects, breaking things, punching walls, kicking doors. Then against my mother, shoving here, slapping there, always followed by wild accusations. It's your fault. You didn't raise him right. You made him weak. Mama just lowered her head and took it as if she deserved it. I tried to step in, putting myself between them, getting shoved too. But nothing compared to what came next. 3 weeks after Jeremiah's burial, I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. At first, I thought it was Mama. Sometimes she'd come in to tuck me in when the nights got cold. But the strong stench of booze and sweat warned me otherwise. It was my father, staggering in the dark, approaching my bed. Jeremiah, he whispered, voice thick with drink. My boy. I froze in fear, pretending to sleep, praying he'd realize his mistake and leave. But he sat at the edge of the bed, the straw mattress sinking under his weight, and ran his hand through my hair. You came back, he murmured. I knew you would. When I tried to move to say I was Eudoxia, not Jeremiah, he grabbed my arm hard. Number, you're not leaving again. You're all I have. What happened that night, with the wind howling through the cracks in the window and crickets singing outside, was the beginning of a torment that lasted nearly 2 years. A torment no 17-year-old girl should ever endure, especially not at the hands of the man who was supposed to protect her. When the sun rose, bringing the light that chases away the monsters of the night, my father had already gone back to his room, leaving behind a girl broken inside, crying silently so she wouldn't wake the house. I couldn't get up to make breakfast like usual. Just lay there, wrapped in blood-stained sheets, filled with shame, wishing the earth would swallow me whole. I wished the earth would swallow me just like it had swallowed my brother. It was Mama who came into my room hours later, worried that I hadn't gotten up. One look was enough for her to understand. Her eyes filled with tears, and she brought her hand to her mouth to muffle a sob, but she didn't say anything. She just sat on the edge of my bed and held my hand for a long time. He's sick with grief, daughter, she finally whispered, as if that explained or excused what had happened. He lost his mind after Jeremiah died. It'll pass. But it didn't pass. That was only the first of many nights when the monster I once called father came into my room. Sometimes he called me Jeremiah. Other times he knew very well who I was but still said terrible things. That I had to serve a purpose. That it was my duty to replace the son he lost. That I owed him for raising me. And so began my torment. In a house that was once my home but had now become a prison. With a man whom grief and liquor had turned into a monster. And a mother who, out of fear or helplessness, pretended not to see what was happening under her own roof. The pain of those days still tightens my chest whenever I remember, even after all these years. It feels like it was just yesterday, not 1958, when my life turned upside down with Jeremiah's death. The days went by, and my father kept getting worse, like a fruit rotting from the inside out. At first, he still managed to put on a mask when visitors came, pretending to be a respectable man, a grieving father devastated by his son's death. Neighbors would drop by with food, coffee, words of comfort. The priest came now and then to say a rosary, murmuring that God knows what he's doing. All those things priests say when they don't know what else to say. No one suspected what went on once the door closed, and it was just the three of us in that isolated house. I remember one Sunday when Mr. Arthur, the owner of the town's general store, came by with his whole family for a visit. They even brought a green corn cake his wife had made. Father greeted them politely, offered coffee, talked about the weather and how hard it was to keep the business running without Jeremiah. I stayed quiet in a corner, serving the guests and avoiding everyone's eyes. When Mr. Arthur asked if I was going to take over the family business, my father gave a forced smile. Eudoxia? What does a woman know about business, Mr. Arthur? She'll help me until I find a decent son-in-law. Then I'll pass everything on to him. Back then, people thought that kind of thing was normal. No one questioned it. Mr. Arthur's oldest daughter even said I looked tired, but her mother quickly shut her down. It's the sadness over her brother, girl. Leave her be. If only they had known the real reason for the dark circles under my eyes, the way I flinched whenever someone got too close. It was that July of 1958 when my father had his first real breakdown, the kind that even the farthest neighbors heard about. It was harvest season, and he had hired a few day laborers to help in the fields. Early one morning, a worker named Curly Tim came to the house to report that part of the crop had been destroyed, corn scattered all over the ground, as if someone had ripped it out on purpose. My father went pale, started shaking, his eyes wide, and suddenly let out a scream that must have scared even the dead. It was him. It was Jeremiah. He's angry with me. He ran into the field, trampling more corn, yelling my brother's name, begging forgiveness, speaking nonsense. The workers had to restrain him and bring him back to the house. Turned out it had just been a herd of wild pigs that got into the field during the night, but in his broken mind, it was a message from beyond. After that, his madness became harder to hide. At the building supply store in town, he yelled at customers, thinking they were trying to cheat him. He accused workers of theft with no proof, saw Jeremiah's shadow everywhere. Behind brick piles, in the dark corners of the warehouse, hidden among cement sacks. It wasn't long before people stopped coming. No one wanted to deal with a man who suddenly started talking to the air, smashing goods in rage, who one day gave credit with a smile and the next threatened that same customer with a knife for asking about change. Around that time, the town pharmacist, Mr. Clyde, prescribed him some medication. White pills in a dark bottle with a Latin label. To calm the nerves, he said. Mama tried to sneak the pills into his coffee, but he always suspected. You trying to poison me, woman? Think I don't know what you and your daughter are plotting? One time, he threw the hot coffee in her face. The burn left a red mark on her cheek that never really healed. Still, she kept defending him, telling others he wasn't to blame, that it was grief that had stolen his sanity. Sebastiana, why don't we leave this place? I asked one night softly while rubbing pig lard on the bruises across her back from his belt. We could go stay with Aunt Gwen. You always say she's inviting us. Mama just shook her head, eyes downcast, voice barely audible. And leave your father like this? Sick? What would people think? No, child. A man is a man. We have to endure. God willed it. She paused and wiped her tired face. Besides, where would I go with a daughter like you? A daughter who can't marry? Those words cut deeper than any blow. Mama knew what was happening on those nights my father came into my room. She knew and did nothing. Worse, she thought the shame was mine, not his. Back then, a girl who wasn't a virgin anymore, no matter the reason, was considered ruined, used. Who would want to marry her? And without marriage, what kind of future did I have? I swallowed my sobs and the hatred growing inside me. A hatred not just for my father, but for my mother. For life, for God, for everything and everyone who allowed this to happen. As the business in town crumbled, my father started spending more time at home, which only made things worse. Now, It wasn't just the nights I feared, but the days too. Any moment Mama stepped out, to fetch water, to pick vegetables, to hang clothes, he could appear. That reek of cheap liquor always came before his heavy footsteps. "You're just like your mother was when she was young," he'd say sometimes with a look that froze my soul. "But you've got Jeremiah's will. There's a piece of him in you. I always knew." At the end of 1958, I discovered I was carrying a baby. I hid it as best I could for nearly 2 months. Wore loose clothes, tied tight bands around my belly, avoided eating much so I wouldn't throw up in front of anyone. But a woman's body doesn't keep those secrets for long. Of course, it was Mama who noticed first. She had been watching me as I bathed in the little back room where we had an improvised tin shower. She came in without knocking, as she always did, and just stared at my belly, which was beginning to show a small bump. "How long?" she asked in a dry voice. "About 2 months, I think," I replied. She went silent for so long that I thought she had turned to stone, the old towel in her hand, her eyes fixed on my belly. "Your father can't know," she finally said, more to herself than to me. "He'll kill us. He'll kill all three of us." That was the first time I ever heard my mother openly admit that my father was dangerous, that he might do something even worse than what he'd already done. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice trembling, my hands instinctively covering my stomach. "There's a woman in Fisherman's Village," she said. "Old Janie. She handles these kinds of problems." My blood froze in my veins. I had heard stories about old Janie. Women who went to her and came back pale, bleeding. Some never had children again, and some never came back at all. "No, Mama, I'm not doing that. It's my baby." "Your baby?" "That's a sin child, that's what it is. Born of abomination," she screamed, losing control for the first time. "You want to raise a monster born from this thing between you and your father? You want the baby to come out wrong, with a tail with horns?" The superstitions of the time were strong. People believed children born from close kin were cursed, marked by sin. "I don't know, Mama," I said, "but I'm not going to kill my baby before it even has a chance to be born." The conversation ended there, with my mother storming out and slamming the door behind her and me crying alone, the cold shower water mixing with my hot tears. In the following weeks, my mother tried everything. Herb teas made from rue, cinnamon, avocado leaves. She made me jump from stools, carry heavy buckets of water, all in the hope of ending the pregnancy. Nothing worked. Strangely enough, my father noticed nothing. He was more and more lost in his own madness, talking to Jeremiah as if he were still sitting at the table, arguing with invisible enemies, spending days locked in his room with his bottles and his private demons. It was on Christmas Eve, 1958, that everything exploded. Father had gone to town and returned more drunk than usual, carrying a wrapped package under his arm. He called everyone into the living room, including the two farmhands who were still with us. Old Limping Joe, who cared for the cattle, and Nana, who helped Mama around the house. "Today is a special day," he announced, slurring his words. "Today my son Jeremiah is getting a gift." He unwrapped the package and pulled out a pair of new leather boots. The expensive kind only rich men wore. Boots that would never fit the feet of a man who'd been buried for months. "Where is he? Where's my boy?" He started shouting, looking around as if he expected Jeremiah to walk in. "I know he's here. I can smell him." Old Joe tried to calm him, reminded him that Jeremiah was dead, that he should rest a bit. My father grabbed the kerosene lamp that lit the room and hurled it at the old man, who barely ducked in time. The lamp exploded against the wall, flames spreading fast across the dry old wallpaper. Within minutes, the room was ablaze. We all ran outside, except for my father, who kept shouting Jeremiah's name, saying he was going to save him from the fire. It was Nana who ran back in and dragged him out just before the roof collapsed. He came out with singed clothes, his hair burned, but alive. There was nothing we could do but watch our home turn to ashes. The well was too far, and even if we had enough water, the fire had already taken everything. We lost almost everything that night. Furniture, clothes, memories, the little money we had hidden in a tin under my parents' bed. We spent the rest of that night huddled in the barn, lying on straw, covered in the few rags old Joe managed to scrounge up. The saddest Christmas I've ever lived. The next morning, still in shock and staring at the smoking ruins of what had once been our home, Mama finally made the decision she should have made long before. "Enough, George," she said, her voice firmer than I'd ever heard it. "You need help, we all do." My father was sitting on a stump in the yard, his eyes vacant, staring into nothingness. The fire from the night before had been replaced by a terrifying emptiness. He didn't even answer. "We're going to my sister's house in Karwaru," Mama went on. "There's a real doctor there. A hospital? You'll get better. We'll start over." Whether it was the sight of the house in ashes, the fear of burning alive, or just the exhaustion of battling his demons, I don't know. But Father simply nodded, weak as a child. 2 days later, we were on a rickety old bus heading for Karawaru, leaving behind the ruins of our past life and Jeremiah's grave. The only thing my father insisted on visiting before we left. What we didn't know was that we were only trading one hell for another. In Karawaru, far from the land where he grew up and the grave of the son he loved so much, my father would become even worse. And I, with a belly growing by the day, was more vulnerable than ever. It was there, in that strange city, in the cramped house of Aunt Genevieve, that I learned sometimes we must kill a part of ourselves to survive. It was there I began to plan my revenge, not one of blood or fire, but something far more devastating. Karawaru was nothing like the paradise Mama had promised. Aunt Genevieve's house was tiny, a 2-story place behind the market where the smell of dried meat and tanned leather crept through the windows along with dust and the shouting of vendors. There were 4 of us crammed into 2 small rooms, Aunt Genevieve in hers and the 3 of us in the other. I didn't even have privacy to cry. Aunt Genevieve was the opposite of Mama. A widow for many years, she ran a small sewing shop on her own and had an opinion on everything. She was the first to notice my belly, which was getting harder to hide. "Sebastiana, is this girl pregnant or am I going blind?" she asked one afternoon while I was doing the dishes. The silence that followed was heavier than lead. Mama looked at the floor, her trembling hands wringing her apron. "Yes, sister." The disgrace came full circle. "And who's the father?" Aunt Genevieve asked, narrowing her eyes in suspicion. Another silence, even heavier. "She didn't want to say," Mama lied, her voice barely audible. "One of the farmhands, I think." Aunt Genevieve looked at me with those eyes that seemed to see through people. She said nothing, but I knew she didn't believe a word of it. The following week, without telling anyone, she came home with a man in a black suit carrying a leather briefcase. A real doctor, not one of the village healers we used to see back in the countryside. "Dr. Ulysses is going to examine George," she announced. "And then eudoxia. I don't want any sick people in my house." My father, who now spent his days sitting on a bench in the yard, staring into space and talking to himself, barely reacted when the doctor checked him. He answered a few questions in a weak voice. Let them check his blood pressure, his tongue, his reflexes. Then it was my turn. Mama tried to come into the room with me, but Aunt Genevieve was firm. "Let the doctor work, Sebastiana. Go make us some coffee." Alone in the room with him, I trembled with fear. I had never been examined like that by a strange man, especially in my condition. But Dr. Ulysses was kind and respectful, explaining everything before he did anything. When the exam was over, there was a sadness in his eyes that made me lower mine. "Do you know who the father is?" he asked softly. I shook my head. I was too ashamed to tell the truth. "How far along?" "About 4 months, I think." "Do you want to keep the pregnancy?" The question caught me by surprise. No one had ever asked me that. Mama had just assumed I should get rid of the baby. My father didn't know, or pretended not to, and there he was, treating the decision like it was mine. Only mine. "Yes," I whispered, but firmly. He nodded, wrote something on a piece of paper, and handed it to me. "Vitamins. You're weak. Anemic. You need to eat better for the baby." When we came out of the room, Mama and Aunt Genevieve were waiting, tense as tight violin strings. Dr. Ulysses didn't waste time. "Your husband, Mrs. Sebastiana, has a serious nervous disorder. He needs to be committed to a sanitarium for proper treatment. A sanitarium? Mama repeated, horrified. You mean an asylum? Psychiatric hospital is the correct term. The doctor replied patiently. He's experiencing delusions and hallucinations, likely triggered by grief, but they could get worse if left untreated. As for your daughter, he continued, glancing at me, she needs prenatal care. She's anemic and malnourished. It was like a bomb had exploded in that tiny room. Aunt Genevieve put her hands on her hips and stared at Mama. Sebastiana, tell me I'm not thinking what I'm thinking. Mama collapsed into a chair, defeated. What did you want me to do, Genevieve? He's my husband. Her father. And that gives him the right to… Aunt Genevieve couldn't finish the sentence, too horrified. She turned to the doctor. It was during another big St. John's festival that I felt the first contractions. It was 2 a.m., and I woke up with a pain that felt like it was tearing my stomach in two. My mother wasn't home. She had gone to spend a few days at the sanatorium with my father, who, according to her, was having a worse episode than the previous ones. Aunt Genevieve, always practical, had already arranged everything with an experienced midwife who lived 2 streets away. Within 20 minutes, Miss Irene was by my side, examining me with her calloused yet gentle hands, guiding me through the intensifying pain. It's going to be a hard delivery, girl, she warned. It's 2 of them, and they're coming sideways. You're going to need strength. Strength was something I had learned well in the past months. The 16 hours of labor that followed were the hardest thing I'd ever endured in my life. But when I finally heard the cry of the first baby, followed moments later by the second, it was all worth it. 2 boys, Miss Irene announced, placing the tiny infants wrapped in clean towels into my arms. They were strong as oxen, despite arriving early. I looked at their red, wrinkled, perfect little faces, and I saw no trace of my father in them. Only new life, pure and unwritten. I cried with relief, with joy, with fear, everything at once. What will you name them? Aunt Genevieve asked, tears also streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. I hadn't thought of names for boys. I was so sure they'd be girls. For some reason, I looked at the 2 of them. So alike, yet so different at the same time. Emmanuel and Samuel, I answered without thinking too much. Biblical names that meant God with us and heard by God. Because despite everything, I still wanted to believe God hadn't completely abandoned me. In the days that followed the twins' birth, a strange peace settled over me, as if I finally understood that the brutal life I had lived up until then had a purpose. To bring these 2 beings into the world, to care for them, protect them, love them. That was also when the idea of revenge began to grow in me. Not violent, not bloody, but something more subtle, more definitive. Something that would free not just me, but also my mother and my children from the grip of the man who had destroyed so many lives. The opportunity would come sooner than I imagined, and in a way I could never have predicted. But before it arrived, I would have to face my mother's final great silence. A silence unlike the others, because this one would be eternal. The first months with the twins were harder than anything I had ever faced. Sleepless nights, constant crying, cloth diapers that had to be washed and boiled daily, cracked nipples from breastfeeding 2 hungry babies. But unlike the pain I had known before, this pain had meaning. It made me stronger every day. Aunt Genevieve was an angel during that time. Even with her advanced age, she would wake up in the middle of the night to help me with the boys, teaching me old tricks to soothe colic, to help the babies burp. She even invented a double sling so I could carry both of them at once when I needed to go to the market or church. My mother returned from the sanatorium 3 weeks after the twins were born. She entered the house silently, looked at the babies sleeping in their makeshift crib, and didn't say a word. She looked older, more hunched, as if the weight of the world had doubled on her shoulders. How's Dad? I asked, more out of politeness than actual interest. Worse, she replied simply. The doctors say there's no more hope, that he'll stay institutionalized for the rest of his life. I felt such immense relief upon hearing that I actually felt ashamed. After all, we were talking about my father, the man who raised me, whom I once loved and respected. But the truth is, the idea that he would never come back, never hurt us again, lifted a huge weight from my shoulders. Did the doctors say anything else? Aunt Genevieve asked as she brought her sister a cup of coffee. My mother hesitated, glanced briefly at me, then lowered her eyes to the steaming cup. They said he has a brain disease that gets worse over time. That one day he won't recognize anyone, won't be able to care for himself. What disease is that? I asked, curious. I don't remember the name. It starts with a P, something like that. Years later, when I was already working at the hospital, I learned that it was probably general paresis, a neurological complication of late-stage syphilis, a disease he likely contracted during his visits to brothels in the region, which, left untreated, ended up affecting his brain and worsening the madness that had been brewing in him since Jeremiah's death. In those early months of 1960, with my children growing strong despite being born premature, I began to think about the future. I couldn't keep depending on Aunt Genevieve's charity forever. I needed to work, to earn my own money, to provide a roof and food for my boys. That's when I saw an opportunity at the city hospital. They needed young women to work as nursing aides, bathing patients, changing sheets, feeding the most debilitated. The work was hard and paid little, but it had one advantage. They offered a small room at the back of the hospital for employees who lived far away. Aunt Genevieve encouraged me. It'll be good for you, girl. You'll learn a trade, become independent. I'll take care of the boys while you work, and then we'll switch. My mother, on the other hand, was horrified by the idea. Working in a hospital? With the sick? The injured? People dying? That's not work for a proper young lady. And what do you suggest, Mama? I replied. That I depend on Aunt Genevieve forever? Or that I rush into marriage just so some man can support not only me but 2 children that aren't even his? She didn't answer, but I could tell I had hit a nerve. In her mind, the only dignified solution was marriage. But what man back then would marry a woman with 2 small children and no known father? The odds were slim. And even if someone did show up, it would likely be because of the land my father still owned in the countryside. Land that was still legally his, despite the hospitalization. I got the job at the hospital and started 2 weeks later. It was hard at first. The smell of disinfectant, the patient's pain, their groans at night. But I soon got used to it. I discovered I had a natural talent for it. Delicate hands for cleaning wounds, a firm but kind voice to calm the agitated, courage to face situations that made other workers faint. In 6 months, I had already been promoted to official nursing assistant. One of the head nurses, Miss Olivia, took me under her wing. She was a woman in her 50s who had never married, dedicating her entire life to the profession. She taught me everything she knew: how to give injections, take blood pressure, recognize common symptoms, calm down difficult patients. You've got the gift, she used to say. Felt like she had no right to tell you the truth anymore. Maybe she believed that her silence was a punishment she had to carry to the grave. I sat there, stunned, unable to speak. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my past, had just shifted. Gumersindo, my abuser, the man I had feared and hated, was not even my father. The man whose blood ran through my veins, the man who had given me life, had never even met me. I didn't know whether to feel relieved, enraged, betrayed, or just hollow. For days, I walked around in a daze, haunted by those unfinished words my mother had tried to say on her deathbed. Your father? He is not... Not what? Not my real father. Not my blood. And all this time, I had carried that shame as if it were inherited. Now I knew it never was. Slowly, the pieces started coming together. My mother was a girl in love. She got pregnant. Her family forced her into marriage with a man who wanted land, not a wife or child. And she lived with that decision for the rest of her life. That one moment shaped every tragedy that followed. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in Rio de Janeiro, the law student turned judge, the one who might have looked like me, who might have had my smile or my laugh. My father, my real father. He didn't know I existed, or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. I wasn't sure which was worse. Part of me wanted to find him, to look into his eyes and ask why. But another part of me knew that if he had cared, he would have come back. He would have looked. He would have written. He hadn't, and so I didn't look for him. I didn't write. I didn't knock on any doors in Rio de Janeiro. I buried that fantasy just like I had buried the pain. Because now I had two boys who needed me, who looked to me like I was their whole world. And in them, I found my strength again. With the truth about my bloodline came a strange kind of freedom. Gumersindo was no longer my father. What he had done to me, what I had endured, was still real, still monstrous, but it no longer defined who I was. I wasn't his. I never had been. And my children weren't his legacy. They were mine. Born of violence, yes, but raised in love. When I finally had the legal documents changed and the land signed fully over to me, I felt something close to peace. I sold the property years later and used the money to send Lucas and Samuel to college. They graduated, one in education, the other in medicine. They know the story I told them, the one about their father dying young in a tragic accident. They believe it, and I'll let them. Because some truths do nothing but break hearts. But I wrote the real story, and now I tell it here. Because I survived. Because silence didn't save my mother, and it almost destroyed me. Because sometimes the only way to break a curse is to speak it out loud. My name is Eudoxia. I am a mother. I am a nurse. I am a woman who lived through fire and came out whole. Not because I was never broken, but because I rebuilt myself from ashes. And if you're still listening, know this. Your story doesn't end in pain. It begins again wherever you choose to write the next page. She was even more afraid that you would think she had allowed all of it to happen because he wasn't really your father. Suddenly, everything made a new and terrible kind of sense. Gumersindo's hateful look when I was born a girl instead of the boy he expected. His obsession with Jeremias, his only real son, and the ease with which he crossed the forbidden line, violating a daughter he never truly considered his own. And my mother, her silence, her guilt, her inability to protect me. All of it now had a new layer of meaning. It wasn't just fear of a violent husband. It was fear of a secret that had been hidden for decades coming to light. That night, alone in my small room behind the hospital, I cried every last tear I still had. For the girl I had been, for the mother I had lost, for the father I never met, and for my sons, who now carried the blood of a man who wasn't even my biological father. When the sun rose, an idea had taken shape in my mind. So perfect, so just, so deliciously vengeful that I almost smiled thinking about it. The revenge I had dreamed of for so long was now within reach, and it would be far more complete than I had ever imagined. But to carry it out, I would need help. And the right person had just entered my life. Roberto, the young pharmacist who seemed more and more willing to build a future with me despite my complicated past. What I didn't know was that my plan for revenge would take a turn I could never have predicted, and the price I would pay would be far greater than I was prepared to accept. The revelation that Gumersindo was not my biological father changed everything. It was as if a confusing puzzle had finally revealed its full image. The pieces fit. Why he had always favored Jeremias. Why he had always looked at me with that thinly disguised hatred, even when I was little. And why he had crossed that unforgivable line so easily. In his twisted mind, I was never really his daughter. I was a living reminder of my mother's betrayal, an intruder into the family he had been forced to accept. My plan for revenge was born out of that truth. It would not be violent. I would not stain my hands the way he had blackened his soul. It would be something more refined, more complete. Something that would strip from him the only thing he ever truly cared about. His name, his legacy, his supposed bloodline. Roberto and I became closer. He was unlike any man I'd ever met. Polite, kind, patient with my children. When I finally gathered the courage to tell him my whole story, not the widow version everyone believed, but the truth, I expected disgust or rejection. But what I saw was compassion and righteous anger, not toward me, but toward Gumersindo. That man needs to pay for what he did, Roberto said, holding my hands. Not just to you, but to your mother and your children. He's already paying, I replied, trapped in that sanatorium, losing his mind more each day. But that's not enough, he said. He needs to know he failed, that he left nothing behind. Roberto understood immediately what I meant. As a pharmacist, he knew doctors, lawyers, people who could help us with what we were planning. And so began our journey to legally erase the man who had destroyed my childhood. The first step was to speak to a lawyer in Recife, Dr. Geneval, a childhood friend of Roberto. I explained everything: my real parentage, the abuse I had suffered, the twins born from that violence, and my wish to sever all legal ties to Gumersindo. "What exactly do you want, ma'am?" the lawyer asked after hearing my story in silence. "I want to change my name, and my children's. I want nothing from that man. Not his name, not his land, not a single cent. I want it to be as if we never existed for him." Dr. Geneval explained that it would be complicated. We'd have to prove that Gumersindo wasn't my biological father, which without a paternity test, a rarity at the time, would be nearly impossible. We'd have to prove the abuse, which meant exposing everything in court, submitting myself to public judgment. "Are you sure you want to go through with this, Ms. Eudoxia? It will be painful, and one day your children will ask questions." "I'm sure," I said without hesitation. I'd rather they grow up knowing the truth when they're old enough to understand than carry the name of a monster. As we prepared the legal case, I continued working at the hospital. That's where I met Dr. Augusto, a young psychiatrist who had recently joined the mental health ward. We quickly became friends. I helped with his consultations. He taught me about mental illness and new treatments. One afternoon, while discussing a patient, I mentioned my father was institutionalized in Carwaru. "What a coincidence," he said. "I'll be visiting that hospital next week for a study on chronic patients. What's his name?" I hesitated but decided to trust him. "Gumersindo Malaquias, but he's not really my father. Not by blood." I told him the whole story again. Dr. Augusto listened carefully, without judgment. "If I may," he said gently, "I think I can help with your legal case. A recent medical report on Mr. Gumersindo's mental state could be very useful. I can evaluate him when I go to the hospital, if you'll authorize it." It was as if fate had started working in my favor. A week later, Dr. Augusto returned from the sanatorium with news that exceeded my hopes. "Mr. Gumersindo is in an advanced state of paralytic dementia, likely caused by untreated syphilis. He barely knows where he is, confuses people, and constantly calls out for Jeremias, convinced his son is still alive and visiting him." "Did he ask about me or my mother?" I asked. The doctor hesitated. "Actually, he doesn't remember either of you. When I mentioned your name, he asked who that was. When I explained you were his daughter, he became agitated and insisted he never had a daughter, only a son named Jeremias. That hurt more than I expected. Even after everything, a part of me still wanted to have mattered to him, even if only as an object of hate. To be completely forgotten somehow felt worse, but Dr. Augusto's report was vital to our case. With a certified diagnosis confirming Gumersindo was permanently incapacitated and mentally incompetent, we were able to move forward with the name change without his consent. In September 1962, I finally received the news I'd waited for so long. The judge had granted our request. My children and I could take on a new surname. I chose Albuquerque, the last name of Aunt Genevieve. Her married name, different from our original family name. It felt right. Like honoring the only person who truly stood by me when I needed it most. Eudoxia Albuquerque. I whispered it to myself, savoring every syllable. Emmanuel and Samuel Albuquerque. It sounded good. Clean. New. Free of the blood-stained history we had carried until then. But my revenge wouldn't be complete with just that. There was still the matter of Gumersindo's land. The material legacy he clung to with such pride. The land where I grew up, where Jeremias was buried, where so many tragedies unfolded. Part of me wanted to give it all up, to take nothing that had ever belonged to that man. But Roberto, always pragmatic, helped me see that the land could mean a better future for our children. And there was another issue. If I gave it up, it would go to Gumersindo's distant cousins, people who had never lifted a finger to work it and would likely sell it off to the first buyer. With Dr. Geneval's help, we filed to divide the property. The part with the house and Jeremias's grave was sold to pay for Gumersindo's medical and institutional expenses. The rest was put aside for my children to be accessed when they came of age. Then, in November 1962, the final piece fell into place. Gumersindo died at the sanatorium. A victim of pneumonia, his weakened body couldn't fight. He died alone with no family at his side, calling for a son who was no longer among the living. I didn't attend the funeral. I sent only a wreath. No card, no message. That was all I could manage. A few months later, Roberto asked me to marry him. He knew it would be complicated. Me, with 2 young sons, a painful past. He from a respectable family with a promising future. But he insisted he didn't care what others thought. I want to build a life with you, Eudoxia. With you and your boys. We can start over somewhere else if you prefer. We married on a Sunday in April 1963 in a simple ceremony at the main church in Karuaru. Aunt Genevieve was the only family present on my side. Emmanuel and Samuel, almost 4 years old, were the ring bearers, carrying the bands with that comical seriousness only children can manage in formal moments. 2 weeks later, we moved to Masio, where Roberto had received an offer to manage a larger pharmacy. It was our chance to start fresh in a place where no one knew our story, where we could just be a normal family. A couple and their 2 children.